So hello and welcome back to Art of Science. My name is Graham Ambrose, an assistant professor at North Carolina State University, and your host here on the Art of Science podcast, which is a quarterly interview podcast that coincides with each issue of Policy Studies Journal, or PSJ. And just as a quick reminder as we start off, please rate, review, and subscribe our podcast. Today, I'm really excited to introduce Bishoy Zaki, an assistant professor at the Department of Public Governance and Management at Ghent University. In the May issue, Dr. Zaki published a perspective entitled Hello Darkness, My Own Friend, How Policy Learning Can Contribute to Value Destruction. This is the first perspective piece that we've had on the podcast, which is exciting. And that just leads me to a reminder that PSJ has now shorter article formats, the research note, and the perspective. But quickly, at a high level, Dr. Zaki discusses the often overlooked dark side of policy learning, examining both the misdirected learning design failures that are non-deliberate and cybernetic, as well as the normative failures, both intentional and deontological. Dr. Zaki further addresses the call to explore this dark side of learning by engaging the concepts of public values, which guide policy making, and public value creation associated with the worth of public services delivered to citizens. So with that, just thank you, Dr. Zaki, for joining us today. Excited to have you on here. And to start off, would you mind just digging in a little bit deeper to your publication?
So thank you so much for having me and for the hospitality, Graham. I really appreciate it. So it's always a bit tricky to talk about conceptual articles or to present the idea because you don't really easily get into the data that gives a story. So I will try to zoom out a little bit to kind of try to piece together where the learning perspective fits in, and then moving from that to talk about the idea of the paper. So as you said in your introduction, the article is about the relationship between policy learning and value destruction. But to get into that, we need to really reflect a little bit on where does policy learning fit into policy sciences. And, we hear the word learning a lot. It's been thrown around for many decades, leading up to now. So how can we look at learning within the context of policy process theory? So when you talk to many of your guests in previous podcast episodes, you'll also see that for policy scientists, there's an obsession to understand why, how, and when do policies change, and what are the implications of these changes for the public. So over the years, as a scientific community, we've developed different perspectives to understand how, why, and when policies change or remain stable. So we get theoretical frameworks and theories like the multiple streams framework, the advocacy coalitions framework, the narrative policy framework, many of which have been heavily published on at policy studies journals and other ones. And all these theories and frameworks take different perspectives to understand agenda setting, to understand changes in beliefs leading to policy changes, and so on. So where does learning fit in here? So for me and many other policy learning theorists, what we view learning as is like, we try to answer the question of why, when, and how policies change by looking at how, when, and why do policy actors learn about policy problems. So we do see learning as a very potent lens that allows us to understand the dynamics of policy making, because it helps us peek into the kernel of policy making, the behavior of policy actors, whether we're talking about individuals, collective, advocacy coalitions, people within the government or outside the government. So by understanding why do they learn, how do they learn, what kind of information and knowledge do they gather about policy problems, we are better able to analyze why they do what they do as policy actors and understand better and even maybe predict or prescribe how learning could be done better. So over the past years, reading a lot about learning and doing research on learning, one notices that, yes, we do analyses and we find all the messiness that comes out of it. We see that, during the COVID-19 pandemic, yes, good lessons have been learned, but also we could trace policy fiascos to how learning went wrong. Other scholars from the previous years, they've also looked at how policy learning derailed policy in the cases of Brexit or any other policy issues that we are aware of. So it hit me that, okay, now instead of analyzing and purely taking an analytical perspective on how learning works and what are the outcomes of learning, I wanted to look at the negative implications of that learning process. We always treat learning as a normatively appealing thing. Everyone wants to learn. All politicians, when they speak, they want to say that they've learned the right lessons, but we rarely look taking that dark hat or the black hat at the negative implications of learning. Can learning, which is intended always to create value, to help us do better in policy making, can it also lead to value destruction? So what I wanted to do in this article is take a more systematic analytical perspective to the dark sides of learning, which many of my colleagues and friends say it's consistent with my personality that's a bit more pessimistic sometimes, or maybe overly analytical sometimes. So yeah, this is how we ended up here.
That's wonderful. And I think one thing that jumped out at me, and as you're reading the perspective, right? So you're touching all of these points, right? So you're intertwining all of these kind of conceptual ways of thinking about the kind of policy system, right? And one of the big things that you set up, which I really enjoyed and would like you to speak a little bit more on, is how learning and values kind of splits or bifurcates the kind of politics and administration that we see in our policy system, but we don't necessarily address directly, right? So would you mind just kind of speaking a little bit more about kind of the politics administration divide and how that works into the paper itself?
Yes, thank you. I think that's an excellent question. So for many years, and I think there was a PSJ article that was published on this a few years ago that talks about that even in research, we are more of isolated communities, we're a bit siloed, and there was a need to kind of start looking at the relationship between policy making, public administration, public management, and trying to bring these things together. And even if you look at the name, when you say policy learning, you say policy learning. So it's more of a policy side and the politics side. But if you peek a little bit under the hood, you'd see that there are tens and tens of types of learning. We have still managerial learning, which is concerned with implementation of policies and more of learning about the on-ground arrangement of policies, which edges towards public administration. We have administrative learning and so on. So the main idea is by taking a closer look at policy learning literature, we can see some categories based on which we can make a link between the higher level political objectives and the policy objectives and the discussions about the agendas, which in this article I argue that are things having to do with public values. Okay, what are the principles of governance? What are the expectations of society? What do people hold as valuable and based on which we should be making decisions within policy and politics, but also moving to, okay, how do these values translate into tangible benefits for society? So the main assumption of policy making is that we begin by agendas, we begin by ideas, we begin by priorities that we believe the public holds valuable in a democratic society. And these things should drive our governance, should drive our priorities, should drive our policy making, which should then translate into tangible benefits that we receive on the ground. So I think when we look at literature over the past few years, we see more and more the complementarity perspective coming up, scholars and practitioners increasingly arguing that the dichotomy between politics and administration is becoming thinner and thinner, or that it has never been that big to begin with. And we see that there is a lot of research that tells us about how the politics and the ideas that are within the policy-making sphere are spilling over increasingly to the public administration. And it's something we really see in today's practice. And if you see what's happening in the United States of America and many countries around the world, you do see how that divide or the politicization of public administration itself is becoming very, very visible. So what I try to do in this article is kind of find a theoretical backdrop by which I could say, look, there is a very clear link, as many scholars pointed out, between what happens at the public values perspective, at the agendas, at the ideas, and how can we move from that to tangible implications on the ground through public management processes, through policy implementation, and so on.
Great. Yeah. One additional thing that I really enjoyed about the article as well is collaborative governance and participatory democracy scholar, right? Is kind of this assumption that if we get the right people in the room, they are going to learn and we're going to have better outcomes, right? That's just fundamental to the consensus-oriented decision-making of collaborative governance. And just one additional thing that if you could kind of pull out and discuss is kind of thinking about the difference or the split of this cybernetic technical venture of political learning versus the inherently political one, right? What we see maybe in practice unfolding being much more political, and theoretically or academically, we're assuming this kind of normative, positive nature of policy learning. So if you could just kind of dig into that kind of components of what we're expecting and what we might actually practically see on the ground.
Yes, I think so. That is indeed the core, I think, one of the core outcomes of this paper. And it's rooted in the idea that policy learning is a deliberate process. When we do that in government, of course, there is a unintentional, subconscious aspect to it. Of course, we learn as we live through life and we accumulate knowledge and information. But the main theoretical backdrop of this, something I've recently worked on as well, that's called policy learning governance. And the whole perspective behind that is that, yes, of course, there's a subconscious aspect of learning, but policy learning is a deliberate intervention in this day and age. And that it's deliberately governed. We design learning processes. We have deliberate decisions that affects how we learn, our advisory boards, the relationship between our advisory groups, the way we structure our advisory systems, the kind of information and knowledge that we let into the decision-making process. We do make deliberate decisions about that. What experts do we learn from? What experts do we ignore? What people or societal groups do we learn from? And so on. So the main theoretical backdrop is that in learning, there are evident and traceable deliberate decisions that are taken to shape how learning takes place. And from there on, the main point is that, okay, so if we make deliberate decisions about the design of how we learn, then we could have learning failures. And these learning failures cause detrimental implications for policymaking and, just could lead us to learn the wrong lessons and, of course, cause catastrophic outcomes. We've seen that again in the case of COVID-19 most recently, where, okay, some experts were ignored or some societal inputs were ignored and were excluded from the learning process. And you see countries going on all kinds of different trajectories with their pandemic response. So from there on, okay, so what are the different types of learning failures? So looking at literature, you could see two broad different categories of learning failures. So the first type is misdirected learning failures. These are in nature unintended. So we are well-intended people. We want to learn the right lessons. We want to help society. But due to several reasons having to do with the ambiguity and complexity of policy problems and, because, bad things happen, we end up making bad learning governance decisions. We fail to identify the problem properly. We fail to involve the right type of actors, the people who know best about this. We fail to employ the right learning mode. We learn from bargaining with other politicians instead of learning from experts or instead of learning through dialogue with society and so on. And these are cybernetic issues. These issues have to do with the information flows that we allow into the learning process. They are issues that are just bad, unintended bad choices. That's what I'd say. On the other side, which is, I find it a bit more interesting, but also sad, are the deontological failures. These are normative failures. These are deliberate decisions that we take, but they depart from normative assumptions about how the government works. They part ways with what society expects from us. So these are the issues where we say, can we learn to deceive? Can we learn to manipulate? Can we learn to exclude political rivals? Can we learn to serve our own agendas that do not necessarily comply with what society expects from us? And these, what I call the ontological failures, we will go to Kant's perspective. So we take here a normative point of view about how should government work? How should society look like? And can we learn to circumvent democracy? For example, let's say, can we learn to bypass institutional arenas where we know we will get bogged down in debate? So I would, for example, decide to reframe a policy issue as something technical, despite it not being technical. And in this way, I could engage learning from a pre-selected group of experts that would support what I want to do. And then I do not have to go through democratic gatekeeping, for example. I do not have to go through a certain type of voting. So these are the main types of learning. And in the paper, I try to discuss what are the different factors that facilitate each of these different failures in learning. So, for example, there are sometimes socio-technical problems where we have to learn about complex systems where people and, governance architectures or people and technological systems interact. And by nature, sometimes these problems are hard to define. So it could lead us to make misdirected learning failures. But for example, in cases where we have very socio-political problems, where there is a lot of manipulation of narratives, there is a lot of ambiguity on how the problem can be defined. There is a whole big societal aspect to it where you can polarize people. And in cases where learners or policymakers have a lot of control on the means of learning or how we learn, on the objectives of learning, on the framing of the problem, then that gives them some space to manipulate the learning process, leading to the circumvention of democracy like we see now in many places of the world.
Great. I feel like your perspective was so rich, right? We could sit here and try to unpack all of the dots that you've connected. But I guess I don't want to transition a little bit and zoom out and just talk about kind of the process of connecting those dots, right? Where did these ideas come from? Where do your experiences that kind of inform kind of getting to this paper? Where are those ideas coming from?
It's a tricky one. It's sometimes this situation where you really don't remember how this whole thing started. It always starts with a blank sheet of paper or Word file, and you never know what happens. I think I've been doing research on learning for a few years now, and also I come from practice background where I was responsible for a lot of learning networks and learning and advisory groups. So there was some sort of idea in my mind where we see, okay, we always learn a lot, but in practice, when you look at it, the implications are not always clean or straightforward. That's one. And two, when you read the literature, sometimes you read the work of others and they say, something like, the implications are not always positive, or that learning is always portrayed as good, or learning is this normative, beautiful thing that's important for our democracy and so on. And sometimes it depends on what kind of person you are and the way you like to think. And you kind of think, I don't know. Is there a different perspective to that? Is there a different way of doing things? Is it really always positive? So I think it comes from a place of skepticism. And then it moves on. And I think over the past couple of years, I tried to build on what I've read on learning and my own work and the work of other fantastic colleagues to kind of put together something, like you say, that's a bit from different disciplines in a way, because I think it was a very conscious decision. Reading some of the articles in PSJ, I don't remember which ones, but it will come to me. And I remember the author was saying, well, look, we have a lot of disconnects between public policy and public administration. And, how can we link policy sciences to public management? And by looking at the idea of value, it felt for me a more comprehensive background, and gives you a broader theoretical canvas to kind of link learning to value outcomes, to implications for public management, then taking the traditional lens, which we do a lot in policy success and failure. So policy success and failure is a fantastic literature, but I really wanted to look at something that is a bit more broad, a bit more societal in nature. So the idea of value seemed very appealing to me. And a couple of conferences here and there and discussions with colleagues, and it ended up becoming something.
Just to kind of dig in a little bit further to something that you had said, particularly about your kind of background in practice. Can you just talk about that and maybe unpack the information you're coming with, that kind of practitioner-oriented information you're coming into academia with, and was there something there that kind of made you challenge these norms, these assumptions of learning after experiencing like particular components of practice?
Yes. Okay. I try to answer diplomatically. So for this one, yeah. So I think
I'm wading you into
it's an excellent question. So I will not mention institutions, but I was lucky enough and I was fortunate enough to work with fantastic people. And what I used to do is I was in charge of creating learning groups. So I was either providing consulting. I worked for many international governments around the world and international development organizations for around 12 to 13 years before joining an academic position. And so I was always in charge of creating these learning groups, learning networks, implementing projects, taking them from policy ideas to project implementation. And we did always do a lot of reporting. And within international development frameworks, you have very structured ways of doing reporting. There are, institutional norms for how you do reporting. There are ways by which you present the challenges and you present the processes and you present, your KPIs and report on your KPIs. And we always struggled with expressing the challenges that we met during the transition from policy ideas to policy outcomes. And it was always an interesting discussion because when you talk to people who are in practice, 10 or 20 years longer than you have been, the same problems persisted all the time. So they tell you we've been complaining about the same thing for the past 20 years. You talk about politicians, you talk to politicians and policymakers, and they also complain about the same thing. Yeah, we've been doing the same thing for 20 and 30 years. And you kind of think to yourself, okay, so what is going on here? What is wrong here? And it's a mix of many things, and you can see political agendas being conflicting that influences whether learning is institutionalized or not. You look at institutional amnesia, which is a very interesting angle. We learn the lessons, but they don't stick, so we forget about them. The transferability of the lessons that we learn, maybe we learn in one domain, but the lessons are not really portable that we take to other domains. So in my background, doing things by hand in the field and being in a very fortunate position where I was interfacing with politics and policy making, but also with project implementation, really struck a chord with me. And this is why I really liked the idea of public values on one side, the principles of governance, the ideas, the agendas, the politics and the policy making, and the public value part, the tangible benefits that we end up in the field. So many of our PhD students come fresh out of educational programs, and then they move to start their PhDs, and I think it gives them a lot of energy, it gives them a lot of enthusiasm. And I find that sometimes people who've been working in the field for a few years, they feel discouraged from doing PhDs or starting their PhDs after 10 years of graduating. But I also think that brings a lot of advantages because your background in practice is really helpful in you processing lessons and ideas and actually getting a head start on your research.
And within that, if you could speak about kind of your pathway into practice, but also then your pathway transitioning from practice into the PhD, into kind of more formal academia. I know for the guests that we've had so far, you have much more of this kind of outside practice. So I'm really curious for our audience if you could talk about kind of the transition into practice, but then also that decision that you were just talking about.
Yeah, that's I often get that question indeed, because in many cases, when I started my PhD, I was told people do a PhD so they can get out and find a job. So people don't do it the other way around. And it depends. I mean, it varies from one country to the other. But for me, after working for 12, 13, 14 years, it did feel like that the natural transition is to take this into a more knowledge intensive, research oriented process. And I think the transition, I was very fortunate with quite a smooth transition, I have to say. I think, and this is, I think, would be very geared to those who could listen to us and are thinking of starting their PhDs. It's after a few years working, you do know how you work yourself. You know what works for you, you know what doesn't work for you, you know how to organize your energy, your thoughts, and so on. And I think it was a smooth transition. I was very fortunate having excellent people around me, a very supportive environment where I did my PhD. And I think it's not an easy transition because sometimes you do have a lot of experience and you come from a relatively high level in your field of practice and then suddenly transition into being a student and starting from the bottom up could be a bit challenging. So it does require, I think, a lot of resilience. But if you pick the right place to do it, if you know yourself well, after working in practice for a few years, I think the transition becomes quite good. So I would say knowing yourself well, picking a place that's supportive and appreciative of that experience. Because I remember when I started my PhD, I was told by professors in my department and those involved in my PhD, they said, you have experience, we will guide you into the academics, but you'll still get some autonomy to do what you want, to pursue the research as is that you want. So it's something I feel very grateful for, and I think it's an important element to consider for those transitioning from practice into making a PhD.
Yeah, and to kind of just build off of that a little bit, would you mind talking about kind of bringing that tacit, practice-oriented knowledge, and then matching it then, I imagine you, when you started your PhD, getting into kind of those classic texts, getting into the kind of the bigger theoretical components, right? Can you just discuss like matching those kind of practical ideas to these more academic ones and how that might have been more challenging or less challenging in that transition?
Yeah, this is also a very good question. I can say that because I have myself a couple of PhD students who also transition from practice, and I see a lot of myself in that trajectory again, because we come from practice, I think, with a lot of fresh ideas, a lot of passion about what we see was not going well, and knowing, okay, now this is how we should fix it. We are going to publish research about how to fix the world that we came from, knowing what was missing. And of course, it's not how it works with academics. We need to be more analytical, a little bit less normative. We need to contribute to theory. We need to have more fundamental contributions, of course, with practical implications in mind. But trying to map what we know as practitioners or former practitioners to academics is always a challenging transition. And that's why I think for my trajectory and for my PhD students, especially those coming from academia, I always recommend a deep dive into the literature. So you really need, it's like a cold plunge in a way. You go, and in many cases where it's appropriate, I always do, okay, let's do a systematic literature review that's focused on this. And that really helps you really embed yourself in the literature, try to systematically analyze what's out there, try to really bucketize it in a way to match the concepts that you see in real life to theoretical frameworks. And that gives you a deeper understanding and supplements what you already know from practice. So I think that process of mapping for me is always important at the beginning of a trajectory, especially for someone who comes from practice. It kind of helps, I would say, slow down that enthusiasm that, if not checked, could be a bit, you could end up doing something that's really done before or expressed in different words. So I think what helped me really well, and I think what is helpful for students who are just joining academia from practice, is to pick an appropriate review method for your literature of interest. And what I like to do sometimes is, okay, make it like a prescription style this is the core readings of the new literature that I'm coming in, and this is the specific field. This is the broader essential readings of policy sciences. These are the broader essential readings from public administration. And you do it more like a vitamin pills that you have to take every couple of months, and you kind of build up your knowledge. That I think systematic reviews are a fantastic way of doing it. They're, of course, a nightmare to publish because there's a lot of fatigue around them. But at least even if you don't get to publish them, they give you a huge platform to start from, something very robust.
So, I mean, within that last comment, I kind of see, correctly or incorrectly, right, this kind of systematic review that you did in this perspective piece, right? Kind of looking at both, as you're saying, PA and PS, thinking about how public values kind of work in both, how policy learning is linking them. So I guess, and you've alluded to this a little bit before, going to other conferences, talking to kind of different colleagues. I'm curious how kind of this bigger interest that you might have had started solidifying down to the perspective piece that we actually see here, where those ideas kind of solidified into the actual paper that you present.
So I think this is a process, of course, that varies between one person and the other, and of course, I think for me it was always healthy to have a couple of maybe 2 or 3 areas of primary interest, and I would say policy learning is one of them. I work in the Department of Public Management and Governance, where I have a lot of colleagues who work on different topics. So for me, it was I did some research on public values, and then my core was already in policy learning. And then I started thinking, okay, these 2 fields do look, not similar, but they look that they can talk with each other in a way. And that really helped me put things together. And it started like an idea to play with. And perhaps if we have time towards the end of kind of reflecting of, okay, what could be helpful about my process for others, we're going to go through the same thing, whether in a perspectives article or any other form of conceptual piece. I think playing with an idea and just trying to get a piece of paper and try to see, okay, can I make a connection here? And there's a lot of failures that happen here. Sometimes you cannot make the connection. Sometimes people in a conference would tell you, no, that doesn't make any sense. And then you have to go back to the drawing board again. And you have to kind of, some things get broken along the way. But for me, it was having a couple of areas of interest that I feel could talk to each other. So whether public value and public values on one side or policy learning on the other. And from there on, I was very fortunate to talk to many colleagues in my department, many fantastic colleagues in the field and in conferences. And that really helped me refine the idea as I went along. It's, of course, part of my affinity towards writing conceptual pieces, which it's kind of, I would say it's not an easy lifestyle to live in academia. And it's not easy to pitch these pieces all the time to journals, but I was grateful to have a lot of good people to talk to. I was really grateful with my reviewers with PSJ, and I have to say that I don't know if they will be listening to this or not. There's a lot of good things about having anonymous reviewers, but one of the drawbacks is that if you really want to thank them in person, you can't. I think one phenomenal part of this process, and I have to say, is that I had 3 fantastic reviewers who were very critical, but you could really tell that they were very constructive. And the paper, when I submitted it in the first round to PSJ, has really changed a lot after the review. And they really challenged me. They pushed me to take a more fundamental perspective to the work that I'm doing. They pushed me on the literature. They pushed me about making it compelling. And I'm really grateful. And I think this was one of the best, most constructive reviews that I have had since I started in academia.
Do you mind kind of more explicitly explaining something that was kind of built out or kind of moved around given the reviews?
Graham, did I lose you for a second for the connection? I think.
Yeah, you did for a little bit there. I'll just.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I think the internet.
Am I back? So I guess the question, kind of building off of your last comment, was just asking, would you mind kind of sharing a more kind of specific component that was built out through those reviews, or maybe said like interesting, but don't touch that for now. That's some other piece that you can get to later.
Yeah, I think the reviewers really pushed on a couple of things that I think were very helpful. So one, I did adopt initially in my first submission, I did go for an overall idea of value without really breaking it down to public values for this public value. And if I remember correctly, reviewer one said, okay, why not look at these things? These are, obviously different things. Yeah, sure, of course, but why don't you disentangle them? And then going back to the drawing board, I split the paper entirely into two threads. You see public value and public values, and then value destruction across these two things, and then across the misdirected and the deontological failures. So it was really a lot of work, but when you do see how it improves the paper, you really enjoy it. It's a nice constructive process. So that's one thing. Another reviewer pointed out, okay, how about the times of crisis, when we have crisis shocks? How does that contribute to either of the learning types? And then that got me thinking, okay, well, in crisis conditions, deontological failures could happen when politicians could use crisis to pass some sort of misdirected, normatively failing learning types, or a crisis could make us change without learning, just randomly engage in changes that are not helpful by, reducing the quality of learning that we do, and so on. So the reviewers really pushed in a very constructive way on theory. They pushed in a really constructive way about making the mechanisms clear, moving from learning to value destruction. They really nudged me to clarify that, to make that more compelling. And I'm really happy with these reviews. I was really happy with it.
And one last question about kind of the construction of the paper itself before we kind of zoom out, as for more kind of practical questions, for lack of a better word. I'm curious if you could just comment on the process of writing a perspective, right? So it's a conceptual piece, but it's also short. I imagine that there's some challenge in being as fast and as quick and rich as the paper ended up getting in the end. But if you could talk about that process of really kind of diving into that shorter perspective piece.
I think so. Parsimony was never one of my virtues, and it's a big challenge when you have to write a shorter piece, which ended up not being too short. I have to say, when you get three reviewers really like grilling you on everything, you do have to overshoot the word limit. Of course, I have to say I'm very grateful for Gwen Arnold, because she was super supportive with this, and she understands, because she gave me the space to do what needed to be done. And I feel that was very important, because in many cases you see editors really pushing you on the word limit and then putting you in a very tight spot with the reviewers. And I think Gwen was a really fantastic support in terms of that. So writing a perspectives piece, and this is one of the formats that I really like, and I really like the way it's being done at PSJ, is that it's really necessary to start with something, in my opinion, that has not been done before, but has not been done before and would be helpful to do. And I think in many cases, we see papers, whether as reviewers or when we discuss papers in conferences, a big hook that many people use is that this has not been done before. But why is this important? Maybe it's not been done before because it was not worth doing before. And I think for PSJ, the innovation in taking an angle that's not been done before and showing people in a very compelling way why is it worth doing, I think was a very good starting point for me. And I've learned that through many rounds of rejection of other papers over the years. And you kind of really learn how to make it as compelling as possible, to build up a lot of tension around your gap, to kind of try to go really deep to tell people why this is important and what are the implications of us knowing that. And another thing that I think was very important for writing the perspective piece was one of the problems, and I think we will also circle back to that again on writing perspective and conceptual pieces in general, one of the issues of these pieces is that you don't have data to back you up. And then the discussion becomes very fluid with reviewers. So when you have data, you say, here's my research question, here's my data. Reviewers would push you on the analysis or would push you about, okay, why is this important? But if you try to put forward a new idea or a new framework and you're not making it compelling enough, you really have nothing to back you up except your logic, except what your understanding of the literature and so on. And I think what we see a lot that is missing in these kinds of papers is that because there's no method section, because there's no data section, you really need to tell reviewers about the logic by which you're building the paper. Not only the logic of the gap, but how are we going to get there? And for theoretical papers or conceptual papers, that's always a bit tricky. How are we going to move by saying that learning could be construed as a value destruction mechanism? So we need to go back and say, okay, we will discuss what are the features of value destruction mechanisms. So you have to go to that literature and kind of distill that and then try to map how does learning fit these criteria. Not only that we need to do that, but we need to tell reviewers what we are doing and how we are doing it. And that's always a bit more tricky when it comes to conceptual papers. The logical structure, the skeleton based on which we build the idea, I think becomes very, very central. And for me, this was the thing that helped me the most kind of try to convince the reviewer.
I think it's so interesting as a reader to like now hear you explain this, right? Because one of the things having read the perspective was, I mean, you have such strong like forward signposting of like, I will talk about this in this section. Like it's so abundantly clear where you're going with your arguments, even if you're not making that argument right now. So just very cool to hear you kind of explain the logic behind doing all of those components that come through in the paper itself.
Thank you.
Yeah, but with that, just kind of zooming out again, do you have any advice for younger scholars? I know we've talked about this a little bit coming from practice and your background in practice, but do you have advice for younger scholars about building research ideas and research kind of agendas and projects?
Yes, I think there are a couple of things. Maybe I would like to split that into two main lines. So the ideas and the writing itself, and the second part when it comes to the review process. So when it comes to the ideas and the writing, I think it's very important, which is maybe it could be a little bit of a too philosophical point of view for some, but I think it's very important. I think it's very important to know what kind of scholar do you want to be, and you want to know what kind of thinker do you want to be. If you're doing your PhD and you want to stay in academia, you need to know that for sure. But also, if you want to do your PhD and go to the industry, while you're doing your PhD, you need to set your own tone. You need to set your own way of thinking. And it varies, but I think for me, it's important to start from a place of discomfort with ideas. Start by paying attention to tensions, things that do not sit right with you in your field. One of the main things that really annoyed me when I started working on learning is that, what the hell is this thing? So people talk about learning a lot, and when it comes to definitions, there's so many definitions, but can we get to a background idea that really works well with these definitions? Can we really define learning? How can we identify it? And that thing really drove me. So the tension, the ambiguity really, really helps. So I think it's important for when people are trying to find ideas to write on, what are the tensions in my field? What are the contradictions? What are the things that I get, which is not a very academic thing, but like, what do I feel icky about? What do I not like? What annoys me? What provokes me is an important thing. So the other point is, many people struggle with finding something to write about. And I think when sometimes we get a touch of divine inspiration, you get an idea, you don't know where you get it, you don't know how it happens, but there's an idea. But these are really rare moments, I think. And a very helpful way to find the right gap, to find these tensions that I was talking about before, is to try to systematically synthesize the literature, try to lay it out on. I have in my office a big whiteboard with a lot of ideas on it. There are like pieces of paper everywhere. So I think every year or two, or when you start your PhD, it's good to go and say, okay, I'm going to look on Web of Science. I'm going to try to see what is the phenomenon of interest for me. I'm going to start asking. I have 100 articles, I have 80 articles. I'm going to start asking very specific questions. I want to know the conceptualizations. I want to know the theoretical lenses being used. I want to know the outcomes. I want to know, by asking all these specific questions, you give yourself this huge grid of theory, and then you can really synthesize things. You can look, oh, they all take institutional perspectives. Oh, they all take a learner-centered perspective, or they are all using this perspective on outcomes. They're all meso level, they're all micro level. This is missing, that is missing. So I think starting from a synthesis, it's like looking at a big chessboard. And once you see that chessboard, you can really see the gaps better. So I think for those who struggle with finding the right gap or idea, this is a very important step to do. Of course, it's important to be willing to challenge the dominant narratives. If we're talking about tensions or gaps, you need to be able to challenge what is there. But of course, respectfully and humbly. I think early career people have this enthusiasm, especially those coming from practice. They have this enthusiasm about, oh, the field is missing this and it's missing that. But in many cases, the researcher could be missing on something themselves in their understanding of the literature. And if you're too rash into this, you really annoy your reviewers and kind of provoke a very unfortunate reaction. Another thing is, I would say, do not confuse complexity with sophistication. That's something that we see a lot happening, especially when people try to write their first few pieces or conceptual pieces. There is a tendency to stuff too many things into one piece, and you end up with what our colleagues from management sciences call a conceptual soup, and it's not good. So it's good to be aware that, yes, theory does not have to be complex. It does not have to be difficult to read, although I admit some of my papers are difficult to read, but yeah, they end up where they end up. But I think the idea is not to artificially try to make something complicated, to not borrow 20 or 30 concepts that might not necessarily have the same assumptions behind them. And of course, never wait for a fully formed idea. Once you get idea, think it through, write it as much as good as you can, and then see it could take a life on its own. Like my prospectus piece, while it started as something, it ended up as something else, but it has to go through the process. It has to go through the review. Now, that would be my ideas. I have a couple of points I'd like to maybe share when it comes to publishing. And this is not to discourage people, but conceptual pieces are notoriously difficult to publish. If you want to to build something new or innovative, because again, there's no data to back the story up, and there's even podcasts about why you should not write conceptual pieces, not because they are not valuable, but because they require a lot of patience and tolerance and living in peace with failures and rejections and things like that. So people need to make nuanced logical arguments, and that's not easy all the time. I think it's also important to be aware of the basics. We tend, and that's a very common issue in public policy and administration, we tend to really lightly use theory, the word framework, the word analytical framework. So all these angles that we throw around are often taken too lightly. And I recently read an article in PA that says what many scholars often consider as theories, they are more like hypotheses. They're not really theories. What we consider an analytical framework does not necessarily meet the criteria of what we call an analytical framework. And these kinds of things become very important pain points for reviewers, because if a reviewer sees you're writing a conceptual piece, but we are confusing theory with framework or model, or then it does also provoke. So I would say it's important not to make these kinds of slips, which we all do every now and then, but it's important to keep an eye on them. And my last thing, which is, I would say, an outcome of my process and the perspective and in many other articles, that it's important to genuinely engage with the reviewers, and reviewers feel it. If you want to pacify a reviewer or to get rid of them or get them off your back. You're like, okay, you want some changes, here is one sentence that fixes this issue that you're whining about. But reviewers do feel that, and I think reviewers, when I review an article, I really appreciate it when people go the distance, when people really give you the impression that they do engage in the debate. It does not mean all the time that I agree with the reviewer, but reviewers do have a feeling if you're genuinely interested in what you're doing, if you really want to make your article better, if you really want to go into the debate. Sometimes you can prove that by making substantive changes or actually giving a substantive argument why you think the change does not fit, or even going out in the review round to collect data, which is something that we see less and less of increasingly. So I think it's really important to engage in the review process as a dialogue. I've had a fantastic time doing that with my reviewers for the Perspectives article, and eventually I found it very helpful.
Wonderful. And after kind of thinking about this in bigger terms, is there more kind of directed comments that you would give to a younger version of you? Things that you would like to give advice?
Yeah, I think reflecting on my first and one of my most successful articles that I published during my PhD, which was rejected after first review, by the way, after first round of review. I think one of the things I'd tell myself is that even if you know that you have a point, or even if you think you have a point, it's important to, which the last point that I said is really take the time to reflect on how do you want to pitch your point across to the reviewer. Sometimes, which I think the case was with my first article, which luckily eventually got published, and eventually it's like we survived that incident. But I think sometimes reviewers could be right, sometimes they could be wrong. But if a reviewer does not like your paper and you think they're wrong, it's important to think, what is it about my paper that made my reviewer think that way? What is it about my paper that really annoyed the reviewer? Was it the way I expressed my point? Was it that I was not clear? Even if I think that I have a point, even if the reviewer misread something, it's important to really question yourself. What did I do that invokes some sort of negative sentiment towards my work? You don't necessarily have to change the core idea of your paper, but the way it's presented, I think that's important. A lot of what we have to do is about the language that we use, the style of writing that we use, and I think it doesn't always have to be a clash of ideas. It just could be a better approach as a dialogue. That would be something I tell my younger self.
And is there like a specific instance that you're reminded of that kind of led to that change of mind?
Yes, my first rejection at BSJ. That would be the thing that
it comes full circle.
yes, yeah. Well, eventually, so I'm very happy that things worked out at the end for that article and for the perspective. But I think my first rejection at BSJ was a very good educational experience. It was under Mike Jones when he was an editor, and we had a fantastic talk about it, and he was very supportive. But I still do come a full circle and see his point about what he meant at the time. So yeah, that's why a perspective at BSJ is always was a good feeling at the end. Sometimes you make it, sometimes you don't.
Wonderful. So before I kind of thank you formally and close here, excuse me, are there any concluding thoughts that you'd like to share with the podcast?
I think I would call on people to really engage more in articles that look like a perspective article. I think we increasingly need that. I think it was very good to see that PSJ was open to that kind of submission and dedicate a special section for that, because it does set the tone for reviewers. It does set the tone for people who want to write a perspective article to know how will they be reviewed, based on what. It also puts the reviewer in a more receptive mindset to conceptual pieces. So I think given my experience with the perspectives, with the short articles, I feel it's a really good place to do that. And I think we need to break down the fear of conceptual articles, and people need to try that more often, because we do see a lot of cool new phenomena, a lot of cool space for conceptual refinement. And if we do not do that sufficiently, we end up with the issue that we talk about of conceptual stretching. We keep trying to fit new ideas and new phenomena with concepts that are already there, and then they lose their explanatory power and they lose their meaning. So I think having that kind of format is very ideal for us to start refining the concepts that we have, to extend these concepts into new ideas, and bring more to the table instead of trying to shove new ideas in old frameworks that do not end up working. So I think it's a fantastic article format to approach, and hopefully people feel, I don't know, I hope people feel a little bit less scared of conceptual pieces after this talk, but I'm not sure, but we'll see. So I hope so.
Yes, I hope so too. Just the perspective piece that you put out there, I think, is a good standard to be one of the first that come out of PSJ. So with that, Bishoy, thank you. I appreciate your time that you've spent with us here on the podcast. And again, if you are listening, just a reminder to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast itself. Additionally, you can follow us on Art of Science Pod on Twitter. And thank you to both PSJ and the Center of Policy Design and Governance at Syracuse University, who have supported this joint venture of a podcast. So with that, again, thank you, Bishoy, for spending some time with us. And for our audience, we'll see you next quarter.
Bye-bye.